Welcome back to the channel. Let's get right into today's discussion. During the early years of my photography journey, many of my shots were soft, and the primary problem was using too slow a shutter speed. Understanding shutter speed is one of the most important settings for a photographer to master. As simple as this sounds, the shutter speed drastically influences your photograph's overall look. The most critical parameter to understanding photography is shutter speed. Shutter speed should be one of your first considerations when making a photograph. It's one of the biggest reasons photographers such as myself are unhappy and unsatisfied with their final shots. And having a great understanding of shutter speed is critical to making great images. So you want to be able to nail shutter, you want to be able to nail your exposure in the camera, in shot, before you even get to editing. So stay tuned to this conversation if you're just starting out in photography, because you want to be able to wrap your head around the essential steps of the exposure triangle. This conversation will help you understand the foundation of shutter speed and give you some vital things to consider before you go out to capture that next image. Now, let's get into some of the technical. I'm gonna give you the definition to kind of help you understand. We won't go too in depth, but this will give you a basic understanding of what it's all about. So in photography, the shutter speed is the length of time your camera sensor is exposed to light. Essentially, how long your camera spends capturing an image. Shutter speed allows the photographer to capture motion or to freeze movement, to capture a vibe or tell a story. Shutter speed on cameras can typically be adjusted in the camera settings or manually turning a shutter speed dial on the camera body, which is how I like to do it because I like to have control of the outcome of my final images by being able to set my own settings. Shutter speed, along with aperture and ISO, is one of the three components of the exposure triangle, often used to teach the basics of exposure in photography. Now, I like to think of shutter speed and exposure. I like to give the example of baking cookies. So as the time I set on my oven for baking my favorite sugar cookies, so we're gonna say the time is 20 minutes, but it only takes 10 minutes to cook the cookies or bake the cookies. If I bake the cookies too long, the cookies will burn and not taste good. Similarly, if you expose an image for too long, your image will turn out overexposed. It would be too bright, and you would lose most of the details in the picture. If my cookies are not left in the oven long enough, vice versa, they will remain cookie dough. If you expose your image for too short of a time, you won't capture enough light and data, and your image will be underexposed or it will be dark. So consider the following before taking your next images. In addition to affecting your exposure, shutter speed significantly impacts the level of motion blur in an image. Motion happens when the sensor is exposed to the environment while the shutter is open, which will be present in your final image. So we're going to use a 2-year-old as an example, a 2-year-old that is running around and you're trying to capture an image of this child. And your exposure time is 10 seconds. Then this child will appear blurry in the image because a 2-year-old moves a lot in 10 seconds. On the other hand, if your shutter speed is set to 1/500th of a second, the child will be more frozen, motion will be frozen, and also blur will pretty much go undetected. So you want to consider your scene and your subject and decide whether you need a fast or slow shutter speed. Faster shutter speed is shorter exposure time in seconds. So this is less light captured. So you want to consider this, especially if you are handheld, if your camera is being handheld, because you may not be able to freeze motion. So if you are using a faster shutter speed, you will be able to freeze any type of motion because camera shake is camera motion, right? It's motion. So an example of a faster shutter speed is anything like a 1/1000 of a second or 1/500th of a second. It depends on the situation. Slower shutter speed is longer time in seconds, which is more light is being captured. So that means you have the potential of capturing more motion and any kind of camera shake in your final image. So because it's going to be less frozen. So examples of slower shutter speed may be something like 1/20th of a second or 30th of a second or similar, depending on your situation. So considering whether you need a faster or slower shutter speed can turn motion blur into your worst enemy or your best friend. When I am shooting portraits, I typically don't want motion blur, such as my subject hand moving. So I consider a higher shutter speed. Now, I will use a slower shutter speed to capture motion or a more creative image. For example, if I'm on the beach and I want to catch the waves and I want to make them look, that blurry, slow motion feel, then I may slow down the shutter speed. Or if I'm trying to capture some of that golden light, I may slow it down as well. So in conclusion, shutter speed can be argued as being one of the most significant impacts on the overall quality of your photos. So it's essential to understand how it impacts motion blur and how it factors in exposure and how you should think about it before taking your next picture. Once you understand shutter speed, you practice it, it will become a part of your best decision-making process in different situations. Remember, there's no definitive solution to what shutter speed you should use in every situation and scenario you find yourself in, but you need to be aware of it so you will know how to use it as a tool to add to your creativity and get the shot you want. Thank you for joining. Welcome to 2023. I look forward to having more discussions like this as the days, months, weeks come and go, because they are coming and going so quickly. But thank you for your time, and go out and create some great images. Until next time.